This morning, everything changes. Sealed expert reports, a psychological strategy that could flip an entire trial, and a power struggle Hollywood does not want examined. As we count down to Christmas, Blake Lively's legal strategy quietly surfaces, while public opinion stays frozen. Meanwhile, tragedy strikes a legendary family. Healthcare battles explode in Congress, and sworn testimony reignites political firestorms. Stay with me because none of these stories are isolated, and the final minutes of this year may decide who controls the narrative going forward. Good morning and welcome in, because today is one of those moments where everything feels like it is converging at once, and the closer we get to the end of the year, the harder it becomes to ignore the pressure building underneath every headline, every rumor, every legal filing, and every viral clip floating across the internet. This is not just another celebrity lawsuit or another trending controversy. This is about power, credibility, narrative control, and what happens when public perception hardens long before a jury ever sits down. As we inch closer to Christmas and the closing days of the year, a quiet but significant development emerges in the Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni legal battle, one that could fundamentally reshape how the case is argued and, more importantly, how it is received by the people who will ultimately decide its outcome. Blake Lively has begun assembling a lineup of expert witnesses, and buried inside those sealed reports is a psychological framework that has become increasingly popular in online discourse. DARVO: deny, attack, reverse, victim, and offender. The idea behind it is simple but powerful. It suggests that when confronted with wrongdoing, an individual will deny the behavior, attack the accuser, and then reposition themselves as the true victim. And now, the person who coined that very term is expected to explain it to a jury. The implications are enormous, because this strategy is not about proving a single incident or presenting a piece of physical evidence. It is about shaping how every action and reaction is interpreted retroactively. It invites jurors to view responses as manipulation rather than defense, and to reinterpret public statements as calculated reversals rather than emotional reactions. But the question looming over all of this is whether theory can outweigh proof, because expert testimony can describe patterns, but it cannot manufacture facts. And that is where this case tightens its grip on public attention, because as of now, there is no singular moment, no undeniable recording, no documented complaints filed at the time that stops the conversation cold. Instead, what exists is a growing attempt to contextualize online sentiment, to argue that the backlash Blake Lively faced last year was not organic but engineered. And yet the internet is not a controlled environment. Outrage spreads quickly, especially when audiences feel spoken down to, ignored, or marketed to during moments that call for sincerity. And when promotional interviews feel disconnected from the tone of the project or the expectations of viewers, reactions follow fast and fiercely. That is not conspiracy. That is the modern media ecosystem. And this is where the power dynamic becomes the heart of the dispute. Because on paper, Blake Lively is positioned as an employee, while Justin Baldoni is framed as a superior. But outside of contracts and credits, reality tells a more complicated story. Blake Lively is not a struggling newcomer navigating her first major role. She is a globally recognized figure with immense social capital, industry connections, and a platform that reaches millions instantly. And that reality matters, because juries are instructed to use common sense, not just legal definitions. They are allowed to consider who realistically have the ability to speak up, to leave, to escalate concerns, or to mobilize support. And when discussions turn to power, it becomes impossible to ignore that when representation was lost, it was not hers. When public support fractured, it did not swing back. And when scrutiny intensified, it did not fade. That does not mean accusations should be dismissed, but it does mean context cannot be ignored. And while expert witnesses prepare to analyze sentiment graphs, engagement spikes, and digital trends, the core issue remains unchanged. Why did these allegations evolve over time? Why did details surface gradually? Why did responses appear reactive rather than immediate? And as the public waits, those unanswered questions continue to shape perception, because credibility is built in moments, not explanations. And this is why the coming trial is about far more than legal liability. It is about believability, because juries do not vote on social media theories. They vote on stories that feel true. And while one side argues that negativity was manufactured, the other argues it was inevitable. And that tension is exactly what will define the courtroom as we move closer to trial. And as this story unfolds, it sits alongside another that could not be more different, yet somehow reflects the same cultural moment. Whitney Leavitt stepping into a new chapter, balancing motherhood, reality television, Broadway performances, and now a holiday romance film that already has audiences buzzing. And while some dismiss these movies as predictable, there is a reason they endure. They offer clarity, warmth, and resolution in a world that increasingly lacks all three. And in a media landscape where narratives are constantly contested, there is something powerful about stories that simply deliver what they promise. And that contrast is striking when placed next to a lawsuit built on interpretation, analysis, and psychological framing. Because while one path is straightforward, the other grows more complex by the day. And as the year winds down, that complexity does not resolve, it compounds. Because every delay, every sealed document, every expert opinion adds another layer for audiences to sort through. And the longer it takes, the more entrenched opinions become. Because once people decide who they believe, evidence rarely changes minds. And that is the reality facing this case as it heads toward its next phase. Because the internet has already rendered its informal verdict, and courts have a way of colliding with public opinion, whether they intend to or not. And that collision is coming. And when it arrives, it will not just decide a lawsuit, it will test how much influence narrative framing truly holds when placed under oath. As the momentum continues to build, the conversation around this case no longer stays confined to court filings or expert reports. It spills into culture, media, and the way people interpret authority, fame, and credibility in real time. Because what we are watching unfold is not simply a legal dispute. It is a slow-motion test of how modern audiences decide who deserves trust. And that decision often happens long before evidence is weighed, because perception fills the gaps where certainty does not exist. And this is where the online discourse becomes both powerful and dangerous, because sentiment hardens quickly, and once hardened, it resists reversal, regardless of what comes next. And while Blake Lively's Eagle team prepares experts to explain digital behavior and psychological patterns, the opposing reality remains that online backlash is not new, and it does not require coordination to erupt. When audiences feel disconnected from messaging, or when promotional appearances feel misaligned with tone, frustration grows, and the internet responds with intensity, not precision. And that distinction matters because outrage does not need instructions. It feeds on timing, repetition, and emotional resonance. And last summer, timing was everything because interviews circulated widely, moments were clipped out of context, and tone became the story rather than substance. And in that environment, once a narrative forms, it moves faster than any press release ever could. And this is where the idea of narrative control becomes central, because controlling a story after it escapes into the public sphere is nearly impossible. And attempts to retroactively explain it often appear defensive, regardless of intent. And this is why expert testimony about online manipulation faces an uphill climb, because jurors are not being asked to decide whether manipulation is possible. They're being asked whether it actually happened in this instance. And without a clear triggering event that demonstrates coordination beyond speculation, that becomes a difficult sell. And as analysts point out, if a coordinated effort had been in place, the response would likely have appeared slower, more deliberate, and more consistent, rather than the chaotic surge that unfolded. And that chaos mirrors how internet culture actually behaves, because it is reactive, emotional, and driven by amplification rather than strategy. And while academics can map sentiment shifts, charts cannot capture motive. And motive is what juries search for, because behind every allegation, they want to understand why. And this brings us back to power, because motive is inseparable from power dynamics. And while legal definitions frame employers and employees, real-world influence complicates those labels. And juries live in the real world. They understand celebrity, they understand influence, and they understand that access equals leverage. And when someone has the ability to call a studio executive, a journalist, or an audience of millions, that ability factors into how responsibility is assigned. And this is not about diminishing claims, it's about acknowledging context, because context shapes credibility. And credibility is the currency of any trial built on testimony rather than tangible proof. And as this case continues to stretch, the absence of contemporaneous documentation grows louder because immediate action signals urgency, while delayed responses invite scrutiny. And this is not unique to this case. It is a pattern seen repeatedly across public disputes. And while there are valid reasons for delay, hesitation, fear, uncertainty, those reasons must be communicated clearly and consistently to resonate. And consistency has been one of the greatest challenges here, because narratives have shifted, emphasis has moved.
And explanations have expanded. And each expansion invites new questions rather than closing old ones. And as the public watches this unfold, patience wears thin because audiences expect clarity, not layers. And this impatience is mirrored in broader cultural conversations unfolding simultaneously. Because while Hollywood wrestles with accountability, another kind of reckoning is happening across families and institutions. And tragedy cuts through noise in a way no lawsuit ever can. And the loss suffered by the Reiner family stands as a stark reminder that behind every headline are people navigating unimaginable grief. And moments like that force perspective because they strip away performance and leave only reality. And in those moments, arguments about influence, algorithms, and strategy feel distant compared to the finality of loss. And yet, these stories coexist because they reflect the same societal tension between systems that fail and individuals who bear the cost. And that tension extends into healthcare, where debates over policy translate directly into lived experience. And when premiums double, coverage shrinks, and decisions become financial calculations, frustration turns into despair. And despair erodes trust in institutions designed to protect. And when trust erodes, anger fills the space. And that anger is not partisan, it is personal, because it touches bodies, families, and futures. And as elected officials debate percentages, families debate whether to seek care. And this disconnect fuels resentment because people feel unseen, unheard, and expendable. And when leaders acknowledge problems without delivering solutions, that resentment hardens into cynicism. And cynicism spreads quickly because it validates the feeling that systems serve themselves rather than the public. And this environment creates fertile ground for distrust across all arenas, whether legal, political, or cultural. Because once people believe narratives are manipulated, they question everything. And that skepticism bleeds into high-profile investigations, where testimony under oath reignites old divisions. And as allegations resurface, the public finds itself once again sorting belief from fatigue. And fatigue is a powerful force because it lowers defenses and increases polarization. And while hearings occur behind closed doors, the consequences play out openly, shaping elections, trust, and the boundaries of accountability. And media responses reflect this fragmentation, focusing on tone, imagery, and bias rather than substance. And in that environment, even legitimate findings struggle to break through because audiences are conditioned to question motive. And this is the challenge facing every institution right now, courts, governments, media, and corporations alike, because credibility is no longer assumed. It must be earned repeatedly, and earned quickly before attention moves on. And as this year approaches its end, these unresolved tensions do not fade, they accumulate. Because endings invite reflection, and reflection invites judgment. And people are taking stock of who spoke clearly, who deflected, who accepted responsibility, and who avoided it. And those judgments will shape what comes next, because the next chapter is already forming. Whether in a courtroom, a voting booth, or the court of public opinion, the decisions made now will echo forward. And as 2025 closes, it does not offer resolution, it offers a pause before impact. Because the stories we have followed all year are not finished, they're simply waiting for the moment when explanation gives way to consequence. As we close this chapter, it becomes clear that none of these stories were ever just about headlines or personalities. They were about trust, power, and the growing gap between institutions and the people expected to believe in them. Whether it is a courtroom filled with expert testimony, a family devastated by unimaginable loss, a healthcare system straining under political stalemate, or sworn statements that reopen national wounds, the common thread is credibility and accountability. People are no longer satisfied with explanations that feel abstract, delayed, or disconnected from lived reality. They want clarity, they want consistency, and they want responsibility to match influence. And when those things do not align, skepticism takes hold. And once skepticism settles in, it reshapes how every new piece of information is received. This is why the coming months matter so much, because decisions will be made not only by judges, lawmakers, or executives, but by audiences, voters, and communities deciding what they will accept moving forward. The stories unfolding now will define reputations, legacies, and outcomes long after the cameras move on. And as the year comes to a close, there is a sense that patience is thinning and tolerance for deflection is fading. People are paying closer attention, asking harder questions, and refusing to let narratives be neatly packaged without scrutiny. That shift may be uncomfortable, but it is also necessary, because systems only change when pressure is applied, and pressure builds when voices refuse to disengage. Even as fatigue sets in, the demand for truth remains, and that demand will carry into the new year, shaping conversations, debates, and consequences. Whether in entertainment, politics, or everyday life, the message is the same. Influence comes with responsibility, and silence invites interpretation. As we look ahead, the unresolved tension is not something to fear, it is something to watch closely, because moments like these often precede transformation. The ending of one year does not erase what came before it, it sets the stage for what follows. And what follows will be defined by who steps forward, who answers directly, and who proves worthy of trust when it matters most.